Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Whisper of the Forgotten Song. It was late autumn when Alice first saw him. The kind of late autumn where the trees, once golden and fierce with color, began to shed their last leaves. The air was crisp and carried the scent of wet earth and the promise of the first frost. It was a Sunday, the kind that seemed to stretch forever, as if time itself had decided to take a pause, letting the world slowly come to a halt. Alice stood by the window, watching the leaves fall in slow, spiraling dances. The light outside had softened into a hazy gold, and the streets were nearly empty, as if the town itself were preparing for something that was not yet ready to happen. She sighed and pulled her sweater tighter around her, wishing for a different kind of day. One where the weight of loneliness didn't press so heavy on her chest. She had been living in the small town of Penrose for only a few months, trying to adjust after the sudden move from the city. She had grown up in bustling streets, in a world that was constantly in motion. Here, everything felt still, almost too still. But there was something oddly comforting in the stillness, too. It gave her room to breathe, to think, to wonder. Yet despite her best efforts to find contentment, there was always a quiet ache she couldn't ignore. That was when she saw him. He was sitting on the bench in the park across the street from her apartment, sketching. His posture was relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. He wore a long, dark coat, its collar turned up against the chill. His dark hair fell in messy curls over his forehead, and his hands, though delicate, moved with confident ease as they traced lines on the paper in front of him. There was something about the way he seemed so absorbed in his work, as if the world around him didn't exist, that intrigued Alice. She had always been a little drawn to the quiet, the introspective, the people who didn't feel the need to constantly speak. Perhaps it was because, like them, she often felt as though words weren't enough to express what she truly felt. For days, she found herself returning to the same window, watching him from afar. He came at the same time each day, always with a sketch pad, always lost in whatever world he was creating on the pages. She couldn't help but wonder who he was, what he was thinking, why he chose to sit there, so close to her window, yet always so distant. Her fascination grew, but she never made a move to speak to him. She had always been the observer, the one who stayed hidden in the background, content to watch others from a distance. Besides, what would she even say to someone like him? Then one evening, as the golden light of the setting sun began to stretch across the sky, Alice finally worked up the courage to go outside. It wasn't that she had planned it, but something inside her urged her to take a step beyond her comfort zone. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, shoved her hands into her pockets, and crossed the street, heading toward the park, where he always sat. When she reached the park, she saw him, just as she expected, sitting on the same bench. His head bent over the sketchpad in his lap. His pencil moved quickly, as if capturing some fleeting moment. Alice stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to do next. "Excuse me," she finally called out, her voice a little too loud in the quiet park. He looked up, and their eyes met. His gaze was deep, yet warm, as though he had been waiting for her, even though he had never known her name. There was an unsettling familiarity in that look, something that made Alice's heart flutter with the kind of nervous excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hi," she said, her voice softening. "I've seen you here a lot." He smiled, a gentle curve of his lips that seemed to hold a quiet amusement. "I tend to come here to draw," he replied, his voice calm, almost melodic. "The park has a way of making everything else fade away." Alice nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something strangely alluring about his voice. Something that made her feel as though he was speaking directly to her, rather than just giving a casual reply. "I like the park too," she said, feeling awkward. "I moved here recently, and it's one of the few places that feels peaceful." He raised an eyebrow, studying her for a moment. "Is it?" he asked, as though contemplating her words. "Peace is often fleeting, don't you think? But maybe that's what makes it so precious." Alice felt a strange tug in her chest. He had a way of speaking that made the simplest things sound profound. "Maybe," she replied, her voice trailing off as she tried to process his words. I guess I'm still trying to find my place here." The man smiled again, a faint glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Isn't that what we're all doing?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "Trying to find our place." She hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had been lingering in her mind for days. "What are you drawing?" He looked down at his sketch pad, then back at her, his eyes suddenly clouded with a secretive expression. "It's something unfinished," he said, almost as if speaking about a part of himself that he wasn't ready to share. "Maybe one day it will be complete, or maybe it won't, but it's enough for now." Alice stared at the sketch pad, but he turned it away before she could catch a glimpse of it. She felt a strange pang of curiosity mixed with disappointment, but before she could say anything more, he stood up, gathering his things. "It was nice talking to you," he said, his voice carrying a quiet warmth. "Maybe I'll see you again." And just like that, he was gone. The sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Alice standing alone in the park. The sun had set, and the sky was now a deep purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the vastness above. For the next few days, Alice couldn't shake the feeling of that brief encounter. The park seemed emptier without him there, and she found herself watching the bench, waiting for him to return. But he never did. Days turned into weeks, and still no sign of him. Then, on one particularly cold evening, she decided to go to the park one last time. Maybe the closure she needed was out there, in the place where she had first met him. When she arrived, she found the bench empty, just as it had been for weeks. But as she walked past, something caught her eye. A folded piece of paper, tucked under the edge of the bench. Curiosity piqued, she bent down and picked it up. The note was simple, the handwriting elegant and fluid. "You were never meant to find me, but I will find you in a way that you will understand when the time is right." Alice felt her pulse quicken as she read the words over and over again. The note made no sense, yet there was something unmistakably familiar about it, something that tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't explain. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine as she turned to leave, only to catch a fleeting glimpse of him, standing at the far end of the park, watching her. But when she blinked, he was gone. The world around her felt as though it had shifted, as if the ground she stood on had somehow changed its course. She stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Song of the Hidden Path. The weeks that followed were strange and full of uncertainty. Alice couldn't stop thinking about the note. The words echoed in her mind, haunting her in the quiet moments of her life. "You were never meant to find me, but I will find you, in a way that you will understand when the time is right." She couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring just beneath the surface of her reality, something she wasn't yet ready to comprehend. It wasn't as though she had been actively searching for him. After all, he had made it clear that their meeting was never meant to be. But his presence lingered in the background of her thoughts, like an unplayed melody that would not leave her mind. Every day, as the sun began to set and the shadows of evening crept across the town, Alice would find herself walking toward the park, almost instinctively. Each time, she hoped to catch sight of him, yet he never appeared. The bench sat empty, the quiet park now seeming even more still, more distant. Her friends from the few months she'd spent in Penrose had long given up trying to understand her attachment to the park. "You're obsessed with someone who isn't even there, Alice," Daya, her roommate, would say, shaking her head with a soft, amused smile. "Maybe it's time to let go." But Alice couldn't. She knew there was something deeper about that encounter. The words on the note, the way his eyes had looked at her as though seeing through her, beyond her. She couldn't let it go. One evening, Alice found herself standing by the park gate, the first frost beginning to settle on the ground in delicate white patterns. The air was sharp with cold, and the last light of day had faded into twilight. As she stared across the empty path, a strange sensation prickled her skin, an inexplicable awareness that something was about to happen. It was the kind of feeling that one gets when standing at the edge of something unknown, yet profoundly important. And then Just as the last of the daylight disappeared behind the horizon, she heard it. A soft, haunting melody, drifting through the crisp air. It was familiar, like a memory she couldn't quite place. The tune tugged at her heart, as though it had been written for her alone. The sound of a piano, delicate and slow, floated on the breeze, and Alice turned instinctively toward the source. She followed the music, each step drawing her closer to the sound. It was coming from the far end of the park, from the abandoned gazebo that was barely used anymore. It was covered in ivy, its wooden frame worn and weathered by time. But tonight there was something different about it, something alive, as though the gazebo itself was waiting for her. As she approached, the music grew louder, more vivid. She stood at the edge of the gazebo and looked inside, her breath catching in her throat. There, sitting at an old, forgotten piano, was the man. He was no longer just the figure on the park bench, the quiet observer. He was something more. His fingers moved across the keys with an elegance that seemed to belong to another time, as if the music itself was a part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. His eyes were closed, lost in the melody, and the air around him seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly presence. Alice stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak, to call out to him, but the words died on her lips. It was as though the music itself had wrapped around her, holding her in place. The song was both beautiful and sad, full of longing, like a story left unfinished. And as she listened, something inside her stirred, a memory just out of reach, a shadow of a feeling that she couldn't quite grasp. The man stopped playing, and for a moment there was complete silence. Alice stood motionless, waiting. Then, slowly, his eyes opened, and they met hers once again. But this time, they were different, darker, filled with a depth that made her heart race. "You found me," he said, his voice a soft whisper that seemed to reverberate through the empty park. "And now, I will find you." Alice didn't know what to say. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in the melody that still lingered in the air. The words seemed to have weight, as though they were more than just a statement. There was a promise in them, a binding force that she couldn't understand. "Who are you?" She finally managed to ask, her voice trembling despite herself. He smiled faintly, standing up from the piano. "I'm the one who has been waiting for you," he replied. "You and I are connected by something older than time itself. Something you don't remember, but something I have always known." His words sent a shiver down her spine, and she took a step back, her thoughts swirling. There was a pull, a magnetic force between them that she couldn't explain. She wanted to run, to flee from the strange, unsettling truth in his voice, but at the same time she felt drawn to him, as if she had no choice but to follow the path he had laid out for her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "But you will, in time." Alice opened her mouth to protest, to demand answers, but before she could speak, he was gone. The music stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the silence of the empty park in its wake. Days passed without a trace of him. Alice returned to the park, hoping to find him again, but he was nowhere to be seen. She asked the few people she knew in town, but no one seemed to know of a man who played the piano in the old gazebo. They looked at her with puzzled expressions, as if she had imagined the entire thing. But Alice knew what she had seen. The melody, the way the air had shimmered around him, the strange connection that had pulled at her heart. She could feel it, the mystery, the pull, the understanding that something deeper was at work, something beyond her comprehension. And then, just as she had begun to doubt herself, she received another note. This one was different, more urgent, written in the same elegant handwriting. "When you find the song that calls to your soul, you will understand. Come to the gazebo at midnight." Alice's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what would happen if she went, but she knew she had to. There was no turning back now. The music had already begun, and she was already a part of it. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Alice stood once again in the quiet park. The world around her felt suspended in time, as if everything held its breath. And in the distance, she heard the soft sound of the piano calling to her. Chapter 3. The Echo of Forgotten Hearts. The moon was high in the sky, casting long, pale shadows across the park. Alice stood at the edge of the gazebo, her breath visible in the cold air. her heart racing with anticipation. The note had led her here, to this moment, this place. And now, as she stood in the silence of the night, she could almost feel the weight of time pressing down on her, urging her forward. The piano's soft melody drifted toward her, and she followed it, each step feeling like an echo of something long buried. The notes were not just sounds. They were threads pulling her deeper into a story she had never known, but somehow felt she had always been a part of. She reached the gazebo and stepped inside, her eyes searching the shadows for him. The air seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't explain. It was as though the very space around her was alive, holding its breath, waiting, and then, just as she had expected, she saw him. He was sitting at the piano, his hands moving fluidly over the keys, his back turned to her. His dark hair fell in soft curls, and his coat fluttered slightly in the breeze, as though the wind itself was drawn to him. He was completely absorbed in the music, and yet Alice could feel his presence as though it filled the entire park. "Why did you call me here?" Alice's voice broke the silence, soft but determined. The man didn't stop playing. His fingers continued their delicate dance on the keys, but he didn't need to look at her to know she was there. His voice, low and rich, came to her through the music. "Because you are meant to remember." "Remember what?" Alice asked, stepping closer, her eyes fixed on his movements, trying to make sense of the mystery that enveloped him. He turned slightly, just enough for her to catch the glimmer of his eyes, and the world seemed to still. "You are not the person you think you are, Alice. Not entirely. You have forgotten your past, but it is time for you to remember." A chill ran through her as his words settled in. Forgotten my past? But what did he mean by that? She had lived a simple life before Penrose, a life full of fleeting moments, distant memories, and quiet days. What could he possibly mean by forgotten? "Who are you?" she demanded, the question trembling in her voice, though a strange part of her already seemed to know the answer. "What do you want from me?" He stopped playing, his hands falling still on the piano keys. The silence between them was thick, like the space before a storm. "I want you to remember who you were," he said quietly. "And I want you to understand what you are becoming." "Becoming?" Alice whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The man rose from the piano and turned to face her fully. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a depth that seemed to reach across lifetimes. "You and I are not strangers, Alice," he said. "We've met before in another time, in another life. And you, like me, have lived through many cycles of this world. We are bound by a song older than time itself." Alice shook her head, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. "I don't understand. I don't remember." "That is because you were made to forget," he interrupted softly, stepping closer, his voice a gentle whisper. "But you are awakening now. The song I play, it's the key to unlocking everything. The past, the future, and everything in between. And you are the one who holds the answer." Alice felt a sudden rush of dizziness, as though the very air around her had shifted. Her mind raced, trying to process the impossibility of what he was saying. How could she have lived before? How could she be connected to him in some way that transcended time? But despite her confusion, she felt something stirring within her, a deep, primal recognition. There was truth in his words, even if she couldn't fully grasp it yet. "What is the song?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile connection between them. The man gave her a faint, sad smile. "The song is the story of our hearts, of all that has been lost and all that will be found. When you understand it, you will understand everything about who you truly are, and when that happens, you will have the power to change the course of everything." Alice's heart thudded in her chest. "Change everything? What do you mean? What happens then?" The man's smile faded, and his eyes darkened. "Then you will have to choose." "Choose what? To leave this life behind and return to the cycle, or to end it once and for all?" The words hit her like a thunderclap, leaving her breathless. Alice stumbled backward, gripping the railing of the gazebo for support. "I don't understand," she gasped, her mind whirling. "How can I even make a choice like that?" "Because you are the one who has always been in control," he said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of centuries. "It has always been you, Alice. You are the keeper of the song. You are the one who determines what happens next." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alice stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. Could she really have lived before? Could she really be the key to something so monumental? And then, as the minutes stretched on, she felt something shift in the air around her. The soft melody that had been playing before began again, but this time it was different. It was not just a simple tune. It was the feeling of a heartbroken longing, a song filled with both pain and hope. It was calling to her, reaching into the deepest part of her soul. Alice closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, and for the first time she understood. She felt the memories flood back, fragments of a life she didn't know she had lived. There were faces, places, moments from a past that stretched across time, and they all seemed to converge on one central point. Him, the man at the piano, the keeper of the song. "I remember," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I remember everything." And as the music swelled, she felt her heart break and heal all at once, ready to face the choice she had been destined to make. The man looked at her, his gaze full of both sorrow and understanding. "Now you must decide, Alice. Will you remember all that was and all that will be? Or will you let go and leave it all behind?" The song played on, its haunting melody echoing through the empty night as Alice stood at the crossroads of her destiny. Chapter 4. The Crossroads of Fate. The music swirled around her, an ancient, poignant melody that seemed to speak to the deepest part of Alice's soul. The soft notes echoed through the night, reverberating in the corners of her mind like a long-lost dream. She stood at the threshold of an unimaginable choice, the weight of eternity pressing down on her with every passing second. She had remembered. The fragments of her past, of lives she had lived, returned in flashes. Faces she had loved, places she had called home, moments that had slipped through her fingers like sand. She saw herself, not as Alice, but as a countless number of different beings, each one carrying a piece of this song, each one tied to the same man at the piano, each one bound by the same thread of fate. The man was watching her, his expression unreadable, his eyes full of a depth that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of time. He had waited for her, just as he had waited for all the others before her. He had known that she would come to this moment, just as she had known, in some distant part of herself, that she was always meant to be here. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice a quiet whisper, barely audible over the hum of the music. "Do you see the weight of what lies before you?" Alice felt a shiver run down her spine. "I understand," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "But I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can make this choice." He stepped closer to her, his presence filling the space around them like a shadow, as though he were woven into the very fabric of her being. "You already have made it, Alice. The choice is not about whether or not you will act. It's about whether you will face the consequences of your choice. What happens next is yours to decide, and it will echo through every life you have ever lived and every one you will ever live." Alice closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She thought of everything she had learned in these past days, the memories, the truth of their connection, the understanding that they were bound by something greater than themselves, something that had transcended time and space. "Why me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why is it me who has to decide?" The man paused as though considering his response carefully. "Because, like I said before, you are the keeper of the song. You are the one who determines its end, or its beginning. You are the one who can either break the cycle or embrace it, and in doing so, shape the future of all lives yet to come." The air around them seemed to pulse with energy, as though the very earth was holding its breath. Alice's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath her was no longer solid. She could feel the weight of the past pressing against her, the pain of the countless lives she had lived and lost, and the looming presence of the future that awaited her. A future where everything could change, or remain the same. "I don't know if I can carry this burden," Alice said, her voice trembling with fear. "How can one person be responsible for all of this?" The man's gaze softened, and for the first time Alice saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "It is not about bearing the weight alone," he said gently. "It is about understanding that you are not the only one who carries the song. We all do. The melody is a part of every soul. It binds us together, just as it binds you and me. You do not stand alone, Alice. Never have. Alice looked at him, searching his face for some kind of answer that would make the decision easier. But there was no easy answer. There was only the music, the song that had carried her through time, through countless lives, and now brought her to this moment. "What happens if I choose to break the cycle?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The man's expression darkened. "If you choose to end the cycle, the song will stop. The lives that have been bound by it will unravel. All that you have known, all that you have loved will be lost, and you will cease to exist in the way that you know yourself. You will become something new, something undefined. And the world will be forever changed." "And if I choose to embrace it?" Alice asked, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Then the song will continue," he said softly. "You will live again and again and again, as you always have. The cycle will continue, and you will be bound to me, as you always have been. But with each life, you will carry the weight of those before you, and the burden of remembering. The pain will be there, always, but so will the love." Alice felt a wave of emotion wash over her, the gravity of the decision pressing on her chest. She thought of everything she had learned, the people she had been, the lives she had touched, the love that had always been just out of reach. She thought of the man, the one who had always been there, waiting for her to remember, to return to him, to choose. Her breath came in short gasps as she struggled to process everything. Could she really bear the weight of all those lives? Could she continue to live, to love, knowing the pain that came with it? Could she keep going, knowing that with every life she would lose a piece of herself? But at the same time, there was a yearning deep within her, a longing for the connection, for the love that had always been there, even when she couldn't remember it. The thought of letting go of that connection, of erasing everything that had come before, felt like tearing apart a part of her soul. She looked up at the man, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake. "What if I don't choose?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to her, his presence almost overwhelming. "Then the song will choose for you. But remember, Alice, the choice is always yours. It always has been." Alice stood in the gazebo, the air around her thick with the weight of the decision. The music continued to play. A haunting melody that filled the night. It seemed to pulse through her, through every cell in her body, as though it were calling to her, urging her to make the choice. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, and for a brief moment, the world around her seemed to disappear. She saw flashes of all the lives she had lived, all the people she had been, and the man who had always been by her side. She felt the love, the pain, the endless cycle of it all. And then, with a deep breath, she made her decision. "I choose to remember," Alice said, her voice firm, her heart resolute. "I choose to carry the song forward. I choose to embrace the cycle for as long as it takes." The man's face softened, and a look of quiet approval passed over his features. "Then the cycle continues," he said softly, stepping toward her, "and together we will carry the song into the future." As he took her hand, the music swelled, filling the air with a sense of completion, as though everything had finally come full circle. The future, the past, and the present converged in that moment, and Alice knew, with certainty, that her journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 5, The Final Note. The music enveloped Alice, flowing through her like a river of time itself. She stood hand in hand with the man, feeling the weight of her choice settle deep within her heart. The world around them seemed to shimmer and pulse with the energy of the song, as if the very air had been rewritten by her decision. She had chosen to remember, to carry the cycle forward, to embrace the pain and the love that would come with it. There was no turning back now. The path ahead would be long, filled with both moments of joy and sorrow, but it was hers to walk alongside him, forever bound by the song. As the music swelled to its crescendo, something changed. The night air seemed to grow warmer, the chill of the past months melting away, as though the very seasons were shifting. Alice felt a deep sense of peace, an acceptance of the choice she had made. The uncertainty that had plagued her in the days before was gone. replaced by the certainty that this was the path she was always meant to walk. "Are you ready?" the man asked, his voice quiet but filled with a tenderness she hadn't heard before. His gaze was soft, as though he was seeing her for the first time in a new light, and yet, at the same time, he seemed to recognize her as if she were a part of him. Alice nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm ready." The man smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and with a single motion, he lifted her hand to his lips. As he kissed it, a shiver ran through her, and in that instant, Alice felt something shift, something profound and timeless. The air around them seemed to bend, like a ripple in the fabric of reality itself. For a moment, Alice felt as though she were falling, her body weightless, her mind lost in the music that played around them. But it was not fear that gripped her. It was a sense of liberation, a sense of freedom that came with understanding. She had chosen to embrace the cycle, to step into the infinite dance of time, and she knew in the deepest part of her being that it was the right choice, the only choice. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went still. The world around them faded, the music disappearing into silence. The gazebo, the park, the night itself. All of it seemed to dissolve into a hazy blur, as if Alice and the man were no longer part of the world they had known. The only thing that remained was the bond between them, a connection that transcended time, space, and reality. "Where are we?" Alice whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the silence itself might swallow her words. The man turned to face her, his expression calm and serene. "We are where we have always been. At the crossroads. At the beginning and the end." Alice blinked, confusion sweeping over her. "The crossroads? But what does that mean?" "The crossroads is where all paths converge," the man explained softly. "It is the place where choices are made, where destinies are forged. And now you stand at the threshold of a new beginning." Alice's heart quickened as understanding began to dawn. "So this isn't the end? This isn't all there is?" The man shook his head, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "No, Alice, it is only the beginning. The song continues, but now it is yours to shape." A sudden surge of energy pulsed through Alice, a flood of understanding rushing into her mind. The past, the present, and the future all intertwined, and she could see the threads of destiny stretching before her, each one a choice, each one a possibility. She understood now that she was not just the keeper of the song, she was the composer, the architect of the future. With this realization, a flood of warmth filled her chest, and for the first time Alice felt completely at peace. The weight of her decision, the burden of her past lives, all seemed to dissolve, leaving only the clarity of purpose in their place. She was not a victim of time. She was its creator. "You are free now," the man said, his voice filled with a tenderness that seemed to echo through her very soul. "Free to shape the song as you see fit. Free to live, love, and create the future you desire." Alice felt a deep sense of gratitude and love toward him, the man who had always been there, waiting for her. He had guided her to this moment, and in doing so, he had freed her from the chains of the past. She reached out to him, her fingers trembling with the intensity of the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." The man's smile softened, and he placed a hand gently on her cheek. "No, Alice. Thank you for remembering, for choosing." With that, he began to fade, his form dissolving like mist in the morning sun. But his presence did not vanish entirely. Alice could still feel him with her, in the very fabric of her being. She could feel the song still playing, now echoing within her, a constant rhythm that would guide her through the infinite possibilities of the future. As the man faded from sight, Alice closed her eyes, a sense of deep peace settling over her. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but it was no longer a burden. It was a gift. She was ready to compose her own song. The world around her came back into focus, but it was different now. She could see the threads of destiny stretching out before her, each one a possibility, a choice. And with each step she took, she knew that the song would continue to play, a symphony of love and loss, of hope and despair, of beginnings and endings. And so, Alice stepped forward, her heart full of the music of the universe, ready to embrace the future she had chosen. For the cycle was not over, it was only just beginning.